joining us today, member of the Israeli Law Professors Forum for Democracy, Professor David Enoch, Law and Philosophy Professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Hello, Professor. Political commentator and legal expert, Attorney Bar-Yoshafat. Hello there. And here in our Tel Aviv studios, Mossi Raz, former member of the Israeli Parliament from the Meretz Party. Hello, Mr. Raz. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for joining us today. And our main topic tonight, it's crunch time for the pending judicial overhaul. Is Israel edging an inevitable constitutional crisis? Let's take a closer look and pick up the conversation from there.
Democracy is in danger, they say, and no signs of demonstrations losing steam. An estimated 300,000 people in Tel Aviv alone flocked to the streets for the 10th week now in one of Israel's largest protests yet, tens of thousands more in other cities. All this over the government's controversial judicial reform legislation. This following a day of disruption with mass protests across Israel on Thursday. Roads and public transportation were blocked in tens of cities all day long. The legislation, if passed as is, would give the government full control over judicial appointments and bar the High Court of Justice from reviewing basic laws. Israeli President Isaac Herzog urging the current reform legislation be scrapped, and twice already proposing compromise, but even Herzog's attempts have been overshadowed by political infighting. The Constitution, Law and Justice Committee is set to meet from Sunday to Wednesday on the contentious bill. The coalition now says that the legislation may be softened. Will that be enough to stop protests, or is this just the beginning of a broader anti-government movement? Will the coalition survive this pushback? What's next for Netanyahu's government?
So let's get to it, gentlemen. What's next for the Benjamin Netanyahu government? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. So, Professor Enoch, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
It's very hard to predict, of course, in Israel as anywhere else, what's next for the government. But it does seem very clear that this struggle is not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere. It is still very much alive and kicking. We are starting to see weakness on the side of the coalition. This is very happy news. And I just hope that there won't be a really bad compromise coming from the president's house that will save Netanyahu and the coalition.
Okay, Attorney Bar-Yoshafat, your take?
I think that if this government fails to pass a reform that will be acceptable by the voters, then we really lost the state of Israel. Because if one side wins completely, then we're done. If 500,000 people, and I'm stretching it to the maximum of protesters, their voice is more than 2.4 million people who voted differently, then I don't really understand why people would even go and vote for next time, because it seems like Israel has citizens who are just worth less than others.
Okay, last but not least, Mossi Raz, your thoughts?
The majority of the citizens of Israel are under attack from Netanyahu's government. It's not only against democracy, it's against the way of life of the majority of the Israelis. And this majority is not going to stop. I think that Netanyahu is in a big problem. He must stop, but he has a few partners in his coalition who don't let him stop. But I don't see any other choices. He will stop.
Okay, and on that note, gentlemen, let's please feel free, of course, to interact. And I would like to begin our conversation echoing what we've just heard from Professor Enoch, borrowing the term, the catchphrase, if you will, from the Iran nuclear talks saga. Is no deal better than a bad deal, Professor?
I think the crucial thing is to, as they sometimes say, keep your eye on the ball. For me at least, there are two main topics here. One is about the distribution of power, or checks and balances of power, versus concentrating all of the power in just one set of hands. And the other is what kind of use those people are likely to make with that power. If there is a deal that makes it at least reasonably certain that we don't see too much power in the hands of the coalition, that they don't control the judiciary, that they cannot pass legislation that is going to compromise people's right to vote and to be elected, for instance, or to political speech, to the freedom of political speech. If we can get a compromise that does all that, of course, compromise is great. But if we are offered, as we have been in the past couple of weeks, the kind of compromises that really make sure that all of the power remains in the hands of the coalition, but they add some makeup just to make it sound better, in that case, the struggle must go on, and no deal is much better.
Bar-Yoshafat, what do you think?
I think that we have a different understanding of democracy, me and my counterparts here. I think that democracy is obviously not just the will of the people. I believe in a liberal democracy which protects minorities. I just like to quote from Professor Enoch's tweet regarding the attack on Kohelet's offices. It's very legitimate. Their influence is satanic. They should not come with a cost. It seems like some people justify violence if it's for the other political view. I think that this is absurd. At the end of the day, who has the final word? All of these slogans, the violence is that you're saying that it's okay to blockade two people in an office using barbed wire and cement, bags of cement. The argument that the will of the people is not relevant, that even if you have 120 members of the parliament, but the Supreme Court thinks differently, then you should listen to the Supreme Court, is undemocratic. And that's what I think some people just don't understand in democracy. Obviously, we should have checks and balances. Obviously, you should also have judicial review for certain things. But if 2.4 million people in Israel feel like their vote does not count, because at the end of the day, the judges decide and not the politicians, then I'm sorry, but that's not democratic.
Yeah, we'll try to refrain from personal ad hominem claims here, but let's do continue our conversation from that point. Mr. Raz, what is the line between legitimate protest and anarchy?
Everything that is according to the law and not violent is legitimate, and in this situation is we must do that. There is no anarchy. There is a legitimate protest of, I think, the majority of the citizens of Israel. We have to remember that just 48% of the voters voted to this government, not the majority. And I want to say it's not that the Israel is full democracy now. You cannot marry in the way you want. You cannot love the person you want. If you live in, or I would say that 40% of the residents in the capital of Israel don't have right to vote. There is actually the court agreed that the government can kill people without even sentence them, and to do the same to demolish houses and to arrest people for 6 months with an order of a minister. So it's not that we are a full democracy right now, but even the basic democracy that we have, the government is trying to undermine that. And I think that in this situation there is no way to compromise. If they want to compromise, first they have to secure in the law the basic freedoms: freedom of demonstration, freedom of expression, the equality, and many other things before we can even talk about any kind of compromise. Of course, they have the power in the parliament; they can legislate, but according to our system, the court has to something to say about that, and they have to think about that too.
Professor Enoch, please chime in here.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to ignore the accusations of violence. They have absolutely no relation to the truth, of course. But I do want to talk about what democracy really comes to, because unlike my co-panelist, I don't think that merely saying that democracy goes over just majority rule and it goes beyond that, and declaring myself a liberal, that's not enough if you immediately following that really do everything you can to deny those things. It's not as if 2.4 million people voted for this kind of arrangement. 2.4 million people voted for their representatives in a complicated system of government that at its best is somewhat democratic. And I agree, of course, with Mossi that it's far from an ideal democracy. But what makes something a democracy is both a commitment to certain underlying values like equality and the whole institutional setup that together, perhaps, as I said, on its better days, qualifies as democracy. So if this parliament votes in, for instance, to severely curtail the freedom of political speech, this will not be democratic, even if my co-panelist keeps mentioning the number 2.4 million. And if this parliament then proceeds to severely restrict the right to vote and to be elected by certain parts of the population, and of course we know which parts of the population, because it will always be the Arab parts of the population, this will not qualify as democratic, no matter how many people vote for it. And if this parliament, as it already started to do, will make sure that rabbinical courts in which women are both discriminated against and are not represented have wider and more deeper authority over wider issues, this will not count as democratic, no matter what my co-panelist said. It's a deep misunderstanding of democracy. That's the sort of good scenario. The bad scenario is that it's intentionally misleading.
Okay, the dear co-panelist, Bar-Yoshafat, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, again, I think we have a really deep misunderstanding of what democracy is. It seems like, again, it doesn't matter which majority would want to decide on a certain thing. If a small group of people think differently, they are on the right side of history. You need to listen to them. I agree with Mossi Raz when they put 12 and 14-year-old girls and kept them in custody during the disengagement without letting them see a lawyer. That is very undemocratic. I did not see the Supreme Court helping them there. When women in South Tel Aviv are being attacked by illegal infiltrators and the court is ignoring them, I don't see the court helping them there. But again, it seems, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Professor.
No, we encourage a conversation here, Ron. You're well familiar with the concept.
So, it's a trade-off.
Ron, please.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what I missed here, but I was saying that at the end of the day, I'm arguing that in a democracy, if you're ignoring the will of the people, and I'm going to go with Mossi, let's say it's not the majority. Okay, let's say you have, 30% of Israelis who are extremely against this legal reform, but you have 40%, not the majority, only 40% who are extremely for it. I'm trying to understand the argument. You're completely ignoring them. You think that they're second-class citizens, their vote does not count. And I disagree with you that that's not the majority. I think it is the majority. But if your understanding of democracy, certain values, important values, equality, I'm definitely for freedom of expression. Apparently, in my opinion, is not always acceptable. But if the will of the majority is to do something, a certain policy, you're saying it's not okay? People say the Supreme Court only canceled 22 laws. It also canceled dozens of government decisions, hundreds of ministerial decisions, and thousands of proposals who were not even brought into the table. Yeah. In which democracy would you not let the elected representatives have a say in the policy? That is unheard of. It's undemocratic. You might think you're on the right side of history. You're literally preaching for dictatorship with the right set of values.
Well,
can you perhaps answer a straight question? If your dear majority decides to heavily curtail the freedom of political speech, does your understanding of democracy mean that that's the way to go? If your majority heavily curtails the right to vote and to be elected, and by the way, some of the people who promote this so-called reform in parliament have actually said that the right to vote and be elected is not a basic right to be protected among other instruments by judicial review. Will this be democratic? On your conception of democracy, can I please get an answer to this question?